Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. My name is Audrey Ronas-Tobin. I'm Director of Marketing at Co-Strategics. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Power Better Insights with Power BI Embedded. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. First, your lines will be muted, but please feel free to submit any questions that you might have in the chat panel. We'll answer all of the questions at the end of the webinar. Also, we're recording today's webinar and we'll send you a link when it's posted, so you don't need to worry about taking notes. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Greg Fritz is a solutions architect here at Co-Strategics. He's a technology leader who brings a practical approach to problem solving and data solutions. His decades-long career in technology has provided him with the experience needed to architect smart solutions that drive business value, and he takes great pride in the business partnerships that he has developed with customers over the years. In his spare time, Greg likes to relax in the outdoors and run. Our second speaker is Tarun Sareen, a technical staff at Co-Strategics. Tarun is the technical lead in our area of big data, business intelligence, and data analytics. He is a certified project manager and scrum master with experience as a technical architect and project lead in technology, healthcare, and other industries. As a food enthusiast, Tarun also likes to explore cuisines and is a certified chocolatier. So without further ado, Greg.
Hi, thanks for joining us. Audrey, please take a note to change my profile. That decades-long thing makes me seem way too old. Tarun, if you could just start into the slides. So the agenda, we're going to really just talk a little bit about the business side and why embedded analytics and Power BI in particular. That's going to be this side I'm going to cover, and then we're going to go into, if you will, a bit of a technical side of it, just to show you, give you a feel for what it takes to actually configure Power BI embedded, and Tarun will talk about that and show you a demo app, and then we'll get into the questions and discussions. Yep. Next slide. Yeah. So to understand why embedded analytics is so important, I want to first, we need to set a little bit of a context here. And this slide is really just stating what I think probably everyone on this webinar recognizes. And it's simply that the amount of data and the different types of data is spiraled in I don't know, the last decade, whatever time frame you want to pick, but continues to grow. Lots of different types of data, the web, partner data, operational, IoT, spitting out data, every second or whatever. Open data and third-party data exchanges, I think, are really important. There's a lot of tools and products where, there's companies that are making a business just out of data. And there are companies like Snowflake's data warehouse that are trying to make a marketplace for data, so where you can quickly and easily get just massive amounts of data that you may have not even known existed previously. And of course, there's always the social media data, which is whatever today's latest hot app is. So again, I think the important thing that we can all agree upon is there's lots of data out there, and of course, companies understand this, and they're trying to figure out how to get the most value, the most business value from the data. Next. So with that, companies are making massive investments here. There's numbers that you'll see in terms of just revenue growth of 35% just few years ago, which has dropped a little bit in the next year, and that seems to be leveling off a little in terms of just pure revenue growth, but mostly that has nothing to do with the growth in data and analytics domain. It's more a matter of market saturation, consolidation, Salesforce purchase Tableau, Google purchase Looker, and there's been several more like that. As companies are understanding the value of data and analytics and the value that it brings to their company and the business value they can get out of it. Whereas the massive growth in revenue may have leveled off, the investment certainly hasn't. This slide here was from a report that was probably a year old, showing 45% of companies investing in business intelligence and data analytics. And I'm sure that number has only gone up. There are millions more users of ABI tools than there were just a few years ago. I mean, Microsoft alone quotes some pretty ridiculous numbers. So again, lots of data, lots of investment and growth in data and analytics market. Next. So the next two slides really are just trying to establish a couple of concepts that are important to understanding why embedded analytics is so important. And the first one, this is really talking about the analytics maturity level. This shows, 4 levels that you may typically see in any analytics documentation or reports or blogs that you read, going from the descriptive level on the one end to prescriptive on the other end. And whether you say that's going up or down, I guess depends on how you put the slide together. But I'm going to use prescriptive as going up in the maturity level. And what's important here is descriptive is more hindsight, really trying to say what happened. And as you move up in the maturity levels, you move, of course, toward the prescriptive, which is really where you want to get to, which is what should I do about it, or actually doing something about it. And the important thing to see is as you move up in the maturity level, the decision lag, the time between some data event happening and some action taking place decreases. And as you move up toward the prescriptive, the minimizing that decision lag is really where the value comes in. And a really simple example that our CEO typically uses is, if you're driving to the airport and there's an accident, right? If you're on the descriptive end of analytics, you recognize there's an accident and you have to do a lot of work to figure out what action to take. The other end of the spectrum is prescriptive. If you had an app that was managing your whole schedule, and the app recognized through location services where you were and that there was an accident and that the accident was going to delay you enough to miss your flight, and went ahead and rebooked your flight and rebooked all of your additional itinerary and notified people that you were going to meet that you were going to be late for this reason, right? That's where the real value of analytics is realized when you get to that level. Next. So next is modes of analytics, and it relates to analytics maturity. Mode 1 you'll hear talked about, which is really historically, although not necessarily associated with IT and internal reporting, definitely tends toward the descriptive maturity level, really what happened. Of course, it can stretch toward the higher levels, but it's very based upon clear requirements typically, and therefore the infrastructure requirements and the administrative and organizational requirements are fairly well understood and simple to manage. As you move toward mode 2 analytics, which is really focusing more on exploration, this is where business users are more typically associated with this aspect, where they have the tools that they can start doing, what if scenarios, and does putting this color and A/B scenarios, and does this color of product provide better responsive from our customers, and because it's dynamic, because you're putting the tools in more people's hands, it requires, and this also, I should add, really where ML, machine learning, and AI come into play. The mode 2 analytics has a very different set of requirements to do it effectively, not only from infrastructure, because running ML models and AI models requires a lot of computing resources, but it also requires administrative and governance structures, so that and master data management, so that all of these different users are reporting data in the same way, and so that two different silos don't come up with different answers when they're talking about the same data. And in even managing the story requires some additional effort. So that's where bimodal comes in, and that's where, again, tying bimodal really allows you to utilize the strengths of mode 1 and mode 2, but it requires the tools and the infrastructure and the resources to do it properly. So if you look at the maturity levels and bimodal analytics, that's really the important things you need to understand, and why, and we'll get to why that is important from embedded analytics. Next. So what I'm going to do here is just really briefly kind of take you through the journey. Again, we've established that there's a lot of data. We've established that companies are trying to get value out of that data. The first kind of, and this is, and again, this is relative, it's not absolute. There's not, an increase and then level off, but you'll get the idea of where we're going at the end, I hope. So there were a lot of tools that came out initially, right? As the data came out, data volumes grew, there were a lot of tools, and this really, this increased the adoption rate of analytics, but the adoption rate, whereas some reports will show that there's like 25% adoption rate, what they found was the adoption rate really wasn't getting the value, because even though they adopted it, they may only use the tools a couple of times a week, because again, the tool, one thing was it was a bit immature, another was it was a totally different context of what they do from day to day. So you got the kind of the next level where you had this, if you will, a leveling off. And again, I'm using that term not literally but figuratively, of the value that companies were getting for the data. Even the new tools were a challenge for the non-technical staff, right? So there was all these tools available, but there weren't necessarily the skill sets and or the knowledge of data in order to get the most out of them. So kind of the next level, if you will, is companies recognize this. They started to invest in training the resources, and you started to get, data analysts and data scientists, and this became, people started to learn how to use data and what to do with all this data that was out there. And of course, the tools matured, and the tools became easier to use, and users learned how to use them. And so you got the tools in the hands of the people who really needed it to do their job. And then the next, so we got to a point, right? And so the next stage, if you will, you had a lot of value, but you're still missing. So next, Tarun, what you missed was, or the situation we had is that, Tarun, next. Oops. Anyhow, I'll continue on. So what happened is the users had the tools, and you had silos of data, and individual organizations or silos within that organization were unable to tell a coherent story. And so that's kind of where embedded analytics comes about. So give me 1 second. I think we may have lost Tarun, so I may just go ahead and share my screen. There we go. So a few nexts here. Yeah, give me to the next slide.
Hey, Greg, I'm sorry, I got disconnected in between.
Yeah, so just take me to the next slide if you will, if you want to share. Go back to sharing.
Yeah, sorry, just give me a minute.
Yeah. So while he's bringing that up, I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I'll get started. So what this led to, right? You had kind of silos of data. You had business users out there who were getting some value out of the tool, but it really wasn't a coherent story. So this is really where embedded analytics comes into play, because what this allows is the application in which you are embedding your analytics becomes really the context for bimodal analytics. You have these individuals who have done a lot of work and made great progress to tell their individual stories. You have the mode 1 analytics and the mode 2 analytics that tell great stories independently. But what embedded analytics allows is product managers now to come into play, and they can coordinate how to deliver the different analytics content in a common analytics story. And that gives a seamless view of mode 1, mode 2 analytics, which of course increases the maturity level, as we talked about earlier, and gets us more towards the prescriptive. It also expands the availability of analytics to more users. And what I mean by that is embedded analytics does not necessarily require an end user license to view the analytics. If you embed it in your application, and in particular, in the case, and we'll talk about this later with Power BI, it changes the licensing requirements. So now, not only can you increase the adoption rate and the availability of the analytics to your internal users, you now can offer those to your customers. It's also enhanced the value of software solutions. So ISVs, as I talked about earlier, you have, the purchase of analytics tools in pretty much every platform now is doing whatever they can to embed analytics into the platform. And you'll hear that, there's as much as 40+% added value by adding analytics into their platforms. And because of that, they can charge, 20-25% more for their tools. So there's a big market in that regard. And again, and then the final one, increase analytics adoption, which isn't necessarily the same thing as expanding the availability of analytics to more users, because as I mentioned earlier, just because they have the availability doesn't mean that they've adopted it and actually utilize it on a daily basis. But because the analytics are embedded within the applications that the user use every day and are familiar with and have the same UI and UX experience, that is where the adoption rate really increases. A great quote is that, the best embedics, the best analytics are those that are invisible, right? So the user does not even realize that they're viewing analytics because the context is the same as they're used to. Next slide. So really briefly, I'm going to talk about general levels of embedding, and I don't mean this in a literal sense. It is just a spectrum, but I think it's important to the context of why Power BI is so powerful in this context. So first is really a loosely coupled. Again, this is very general, but you have an application in your analytics that are running separately. They might be linked via URLs, and they would share the data, and maybe even SSO, yeah. But the context between the two is different, right? And so we talked about this several times about having that common context for the user and how important it is. And then there's, more of an integrated level. So it's really kind of a next level that might embed the analytics in an iframe, or you might have a report package that you're using but iframes have some potential security risks. And then the issue is that your analytics is really operating independently of your application. So mobile responsiveness is an example there. You may lose some of that UI UX that you would otherwise have in the final level that I'm really is fully embedded, where the analytics and the application are side by side, communicating bidirectionally, and they have the exact same user experience and responsiveness. Next. And so that really brings us to why Microsoft Power BI embedded. First of all, Power BI, irregardless of embedding, is a Gartner Magic Quadrant leader by leaps and bounds. They have more deployments of 1,000+ users than any other vendor that Gartner looked at. So again, the adoption rate is huge just for Power BI itself. And Microsoft, as I mentioned earlier, is making a huge investment in Power BI. When they launched back in, I think, 2013, they were termed a follower. In the next 5 years, they'd surpassed everyone. So that's how much they're investing in the product. You, of course, may already have Power BI Pro accounts, and you may already be using the Power BI service. So this is a good way to tell a common analytics story, because you have the data and the silos of analytics that you can use. Power BI includes the capabilities for ML and AI and incorporating that in. So Power BI is a powerful tool in itself, is the key there. And then what Power BI does is it gives you JavaScript libraries and a set of APIs that allows you to embed your analytics into your application. And again, we talked about how important that is to give that context, that similar context of your application in your analytics in a fully embedded manner. Power BI is important because it gives you a seamless integration with other Microsoft cloud services, such as Active Directory. So you have your security already addressed, and you can use Power BI, and you can use Active Directory and roles and privileges that come with it to manage the access to the data. And again, Power BI does actually come with Office 365 E5. So again, it may be a tool that you already have access to within your organization. Power BI shifts you a cloud capacity-based model. No longer, or it changes the requirement for licenses. You only need Power BI Pro license for the people developing the reports and publishing the reports. You instead get charged on the resources that you use, which is the common cloud-based model. And again, we talked about the fact that Mode 1 and Mode 2 analytics have a very different requirement in terms of resources, so that's very important. And then finally, just real quickly, in the interest of time, Power BI and embedding, that we talked about, enables the bimodal analytics, therefore promoting your analytics maturity and really making your analytics, your business intelligence tools invisible, which is really where the value comes in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tarun to, again, talk a little bit about the configuration and the technical side of it, and show an actual demo of a Power BI application.
Hey, thanks, Greg. And I apologize if you've seen some glitches. There was some network disconnecting at my side, but I hope it doesn't happen again. When we talk about configuring the Power BI embedded application, we are basically talking about 3 steps. 2 out of these 3 steps are basically configurations, and mostly would be just one-time activity. The first step would be around configuring certain aspects of the Azure Active Directory. So you need to have an Azure Active Directory configured. So the first thing we'll do on the Azure is basically create an Active Directory security group. If you look at this particular diagram, you'll see that the Azure Active Directory is created. Then we create an app, and with respect to that app, we create a client secret. Once an app is created, you basically use something called as a service principal. In context to Power BI embedded, we're going to authenticate with the service principal and the client secret. So just to save time, we are basically not going to be creating those manually, but I do have some screenshots for your references. The first step is basically just creating the Azure Active Directory security group. We have an Active Directory for core strategics, and you can go to the Active Directory itself, and inside that groups, and you can create the security group. Here we created an Active Directory security group called Power BI Embedded Demo. The next one is to create an app. The app is again also created from within the Active Directory. So you can go to the Active Directory and you can go to app registrations, and it's a very simple form to fill up, wherein you create the app. Once the app is created, that will generate certain parameters and properties which you should take a note of. Now these properties are then later on utilized, when you're basically creating the application. So you should note down the client ID, the tenant ID, and the object ID. The next step is basically to create an app secret. So we are going to be using the app as a service principal and the app secret to basically authenticate the application. So the same you can do from within the app. There's an option for certificates and for secrets, and you can create your client secret. Then you basically add the app onto the security group that was created earlier. So we created, we basically added the Power BI Embed Demo app that we created earlier onto the security group that we created. Now this covers the part of Azure configuration. The other part is basically configuring the Power BI service. The Power BI service is where you would publish all your Power BI reports, dashboards, styles, and everything. And it is where your REST APIs are hosted. So you need to enable these REST APIs to be accessed by the service principal, and the security group that we just created gets added to this Power BI. So the next step is basically, you first of all, if you don't have a Power BI workspace, of course, go ahead and create your Power BI workspace. Then you need to basically go into the admin portal, go to tenant settings, and you enable the under the developer settings, you enable to allow the service principals to use the Power BI APIs. Also, we added a security group as part of this. So we are basically restricting only to this security group to be able to access the service principals. Of course, you need to have the Power BI administrator role to be able to do these settings. And again, this is just a one-time setting. The next step is basically the workspace that you create. You basically add your security group as the admin to that workspace. So you basically go to the workspace, there are 3 dots, you give access, and like how you give access to any other user, you basically give access to the security group as well. Now for the demo purposes, we've not created an embed capacity, but when you're dealing with Power BI embedded, and you're basically ready to take it to production, you need an embed capacity. Either you use the embed capacity, or you basically create, you use the premium capacity. If you don't have a premium capacity, you can just create an embed capacity from Azure, and you associate that embed capacity to your workspace through Power BI service. So once you've configured your Azure services and you've configured your Power BI service, the next step is basically to start integrating your reports and dashboards onto the application, and start utilizing the REST APIs and the JavaScript libraries that are coming, that are basically provided by Power BI service. So for the purpose of this demo, I'm utilizing one of the demo reports that was provided by Microsoft. The Power BI report that you see here, this is basically something that is published on the Power BI service. Now, when you publish this onto your workspace, you see the workspace ID and the report ID. You can take note of this. These are the properties that will be configured within the application later on. Now, this piece of code is basically, the project that we created. This is a demo app. This is also available on the Microsoft website, wherein the first step is basically to authenticate the application. So we created the app earlier on, the service principal. We basically use that, and we use the secret, and we generate, we basically call the REST APIs to authenticate the application, which basically generates the embed token. Now, this embed token is then passed on to the front end, wherein the front end libraries are used, and the embed token has to be a valid embed token to be able to render any reports onto the application. Now, this is the code, which is basically the front end aspect of it. If you look at the library that we're using, JavaScript library here, it basically has Power BI.embed function, which basically takes two parameters. One is a container, and the other is a config. The config is where you can configure and customize how do you want your reports to be rendered onto your application. Of course, it also gives you an option whether you want a report, a tile, or a dashboard to be rendered. You pass on your embed token that was generated for validation. You basically pass on the within the report if you want to have a particular report tab to be displayed and not the entire report. You can also choose between whether you want the report to be a view mode or you want it in an edit mode. And there are multiple settings that are available, with which you can customize the report onto your application. So this is, it's a very simple, application that is created here. And if you look at, this is a screenshot of the application. I can also run this. So I have this Visual Studio project already set up. This is the same, this is where I took the screenshots from. Also, this is the page that I was showing earlier on. There are configuration within this, and what I can do is right now just run this and show you. So when I run this, it will basically, I just have one report that I showed on the Power BI service that is basically going to be rendered onto the application. What it is doing in the background is the first step is it will authenticate the service principal. It will get the embed token. The embed token gets passed on to the front end, and the front end basically has the report ID, which basically renders the report ID. Now, once the report is rendered onto the screen, it basically is similar to how the user would be using a Power BI service or the Power BI desktop. So it is in an interactive mode. The user can click on a particular filter, the reports will get rendered, the values get changed, and it's completely in an interactive mode here. So this is, it's a very simple example of what Power BI embed report can do.
What Tarun has been able to show you pretty quickly is, the basic configuration, give you at least an idea of the context in which that configuration exists, and what that looks like, and how that embedded application has a look and feel, and that is responsive and is interacting with the analytics, and the application are interacting side by side. So with that, I just want to just mention to you what Co-Strategics can do for you in this regard. We have implemented embedded applications for customers. The initial, recently as COVID hit, we had a customer who was very interested in getting something up and running immediately that they could present to their customers. So we implemented that for them. We have certified Power BI resources within the organization. And we also do machine learning and AI. We have data scientists and data analysts that we can help you with. I mean, we are generally a data strategy company that we lead with strategy and then help you to develop that strategy. And we have also the technical aptitude and resources to then help you to deliver on that strategy. So the next slide, Tarun. We have a lot of experience in implementing digital platforms, digital e-commerce and integrations with all of those. We also have our own UI UX resources, so that when you are generating your analytics reports, we can assist you with that, as well as the embedded application and the UI UX aspects of that. So with that, I will turn it over to Audrey, and we'll see what time we have left to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg and Tarun. That was a great presentation. We did have a couple of questions come through. So if anybody else has questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A or through the chat, and we'll get to those now. The first question that came through is, are there cases when you would recommend building your own reporting or dashboard apps versus using an embedded BI tool?
Well, I think it comes down to the complexity and the number of users. There's the price that you'll pay, a different price to utilize the capabilities of Power BI embedded or any analytics tool. And I think it really will come down to what that analytics story you're trying to tell is. There certainly is value in using simple packages or doing write your own, but the ability to have the analytics and the application interacting side by side and using the application to tell a complex analytic story is a very valuable tool.
Okay, the next question is curious to see if we're finding more traction in B2B or in B2C.
Oh, I think, I don't know that it would necessarily be one or the other. As I mentioned, pretty much everyone in the large, PeopleSoft and Oracle and everyone is investing in analytics and embedded analytics simply because, again, having the same context for your analytics and your application is just a game changer. So I think everyone is trying to move to a more embedded model, simply because you have that similar context, and that increases the adoption rate, and also allows you again to have the ability to control that story and have governance and all of those other things that are really important to a mature data and analytics strategy within your organization.
The next question is, do we have any case examples of installations using Power BI? And maybe just not mentioning any customer names when we do that.
Does Co-Strategics?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we have resources with Power BI certification, Microsoft Power BI certification. I can think of at least a dozen customers where we have done Power BI reports and helped customers with that. Like I said, we have multiple customers that we have done embedded applications for. So yes, we have a lot of experience in this regard, and just in data and data strategy in general.
Great. The next question is, you talked about license management and capacity costs. How much does a Power BI embedded solution cost?
Well, like anything on the cloud, it depends. It really comes down to how much capacity you use, and that's the way it's priced. So you pay for capacity. It starts with, I think it's like an A4 level at about $795 a month, if I remember correctly. And and then they have increasing levels of capacity. So that's the capacity model. And as I mentioned earlier, so anyone creating and or publishing, well, really publishing the reports requires a Power BI Pro license, which are $10 a month. Of course, if you can have users have the desktop version to create, initial reports before they actually publish them. But that's basically it. You need some number of licenses, Power BI licenses for the people publishing, and then it's really a matter of how much capacity you need.
Great. Can you tell us what tech stack is needed to support Power BI embedded? Can you embed in Microsoft applications only, or also in applications using Java, React, or others?
Tarun, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. So basically, there are two important components here when you're integrating with Power BI. One is the REST APIs, which is basically hosted by Microsoft. So it basically, when you have REST API, you can basically support any tech stack, and it works with Java, .NET, any tech stack that you want. And the front end component basically has JavaScript, libraries and components. It does have support for React. Recently, I think a couple of months back, it came up with this, especially supporting the React. There are also sample applications you can find online, which Microsoft provides with a sample for JavaScript related and React specific applications. So pretty much, any tech stack.
Great, and it looks like this is the last question. How long does it take to implement a Power BI embedded application?
All right, I'm cheating. I'm going to say it depends again. I mean, you just saw where Tarun pulled up a sample application. So it all comes down to what you want to put into the application, right? It's like any application, the requirements and the features and functionality. Just to get up a sample app up and running, you can do quite quickly. Again, there's sample code that's out there on Microsoft website. So, you could take that sample code and you could get it up and running within hours. We put something together in a full application starting from scratch, including data model and integration to external databases. And I think it was less than 30 days for a customer. So it's not terribly difficult. And again, it really just comes down to the, how robust and how full functioning and what are the interfaces.
Great. Well, thank you. And this concludes our webinar. We really appreciate you joining us today. We'll be sending you a survey via email. And so if you would please fill that out when you get that. Don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.